And welcome back everyone to the recap of round number 2 of the Austrian Chess Championship. Today I had the black pieces against international master Konstantin Peyrer, and I believe that it was a pretty decent game overall. I think that both of us played quite well, but let's go through it together. So I had the black pieces. He went for d4, knight f6, c4. And as usually, I went for e6, knight c3. And here today I didn't go for the Nimzo, but instead went for d5, allowing my opponent to go for the Carlsbad, which he accepted. He took on d5, e takes d5, bishop g5. So this is, of course, quite a well-known territory with many games being played. But here already I went for this move order with c6. Which isn't anything special just yet, but I followed it up with a line which is quite different than what you typically get from this Carlsbad. Another move order is to just go bishop e7 here, and usually play goes something like e3, short castle, bishop d3. And nowadays white players usually play this line with knight e2 and short castle, and later on are trying to build the center with f3 and e4. And of course black has many different setups to play here. One argument for waiting with c6 would be that black could play h6 here, and sometimes white does have these ideas to retreat the bishop to f4, and if black hasn't played c6 just yet, then black can always go for this move c5, which works specifically well if the bishop is not on this diagonal anymore. So that's one argument which speaks against which speaks for not playing c6 just yet. But I played c6 with the idea that after e3 I want to go bishop f5. I already had one game in this exact position against Radoslav Wojtaszek in the Czech League, where I also recorded a recap actually, which you can find on my channel. And the idea of this move is that if white develops now with bishop d3, then black can exchange those bishops, which is really what black loves to do, because you can see all of those pawns are on, all of the central pawns are on light squares, and that's why you would like to get rid of this bishop from c8. So here we could exchange our bad bishop against white's good bishop, the light square bishop. This is still what Wojtaszek played against me, and it's still a playable position. Later on I got into some trouble against him. Later the game ended in a draw, but this is not supposed to be that critical. The critical move is what my opponent also played, which is queen f3. And those ideas sometimes exist. Here the problem is that black will end up with doubled pawns. There's also a similar idea with queen b3. Here black typically goes queen b6, and then white can also capture here. It does lead to sort of similar positions. There are some nuances here, but the structure is quite similar, or basically the same. So after queen f3, I went bishop g6, which is the main move. Bishop e6, I believe, is also possible. I think that the German grandmaster Matthias Blübaum played this a couple of times, which also leads to kind of similar positions. The one benefit of having the bishop on e6 is that it doesn't run into some h4, h5 ideas. But of course, the bishop on g6 is also quite active because it looks onto this diagonal. Now white, of course, has to take on f6, otherwise I would just develop with bishop e7 and the queen on f3 would be a bit misplaced. So white, my opponent also took on f6, and black typically goes into this endgame here. If g takes f6, black is just stuck with a horrible position, and the king is not gonna really find any shelter, and white can somehow try to regroup the knight to f5. So this would be quite bad for black. And the endgame, I first saw this in, I think it was 2015 or so, and back then I thought this is a line which I'm never going to play with the black pieces, because it just looks like white is playing for 2 results, which is probably also the case. White's position is a tad bit better, but it's not as bad as it looks for black, and what often happens is that white actually overpushes and loses some games here. I had one game with white pieces against Dutch Grandmaster Erwin Lamy, and in that game I played the move knight f3, and here he played bishop b4, which is quite an interesting line, and the game went, let me think how it was. No, he actually went a5 here, I believe. I think that was the move he made. And the point was later on, I think the game was knight h4, bishop b4, a3, take, and then b5. This was my game against Erwin Lamy, if I'm not mixing anything up. And the position was still, of course, very playable, but he also got his chances in the game, definitely. The point is black wants to go a4 here, and if white goes a4 himself, which I did in the game, then after black takes, black will get knight d7, knight b6, and this passed a pawn can be quite annoying sometimes. So there have been quite some developments in this line. This a5 move is one thing. The old main move, I think, was knight d7, which is still also sort of a right. Here, after the move knight h4, there was a famous game between Magnus Carlsen and Vladimir Kramnik, where Magnus made some pretty brilliant novelty. I think it was after some move like bishop d6, where Magnus played this regrouping with knight e2, knight g3. I'm not sure if bishop d6 was a move, but that game was quite famous, and it's a model game of how things should not end up for black in this line. Because if white gets one knight to f5, or sometimes also has ideas to trap the bishop, then black, of course, is in quite some trouble. But my opponent went h4, which is another move. Here I went h5. Black can also allow h5 to happen. I think knight d7, for example, is another move, and the bishop goes to f5. But I just wanted to stop this pawn, and I was still following my analysis. Here my opponent went rook d1, and I still knew the position, but for some reason I decided to sort of freestyle. I went knight d7 after some thought, because I just thought it's very natural. I still remember that my analysis went bishop b4, which is kind of similar to the idea which Erwin Lamy played against me. And I think what I analyzed was after bishop d3 to just take here and then go for something like b5. I think it was that, and I was looking at some positions like this in the game, but I wasn't entirely sure what happens if he pushes e4 at some moment. For example, knight g3 and knight b6, e4. I was not entirely sure. Should definitely be okay for black, but I was just not sure if this is the position I actually want. I mean, those double pawns are, of course, kind of a long-term issue, and the pawn on h5 can be a weakness as well. So I knew that this was my analysis, but I didn't really like it over the board. That sometimes does happen. So I decided to go knight d7, which is also very natural. I just wanna develop. And here he went bishop d3. So that's also the idea of rook d1. And here I decided to take on d3, which is typically not what you want to do, because you want to keep the tension and wait for white to take on g6. Like if bishop d6, of course, white would never want to take on g6, because then black's pawn structure is fully healthy again. But I wanted to take right away to then immediately push f5, which, yeah, I didn't know at all, but of course this plan is quite well known. At least to me it was, to just play f5, not allow any e4 business and so on, and just play for sort of a fortress. That's also kind of the main idea of the whole line, to just play for a fortress and take your chances if you get it, and if your opponent plays carefully, then it's in most cases just going to be a draw, which I was also completely okay in that game, because I played against a very strong opponent. But I decided to take on d3. The reason was that if bishop d6, I was a bit scared of some e4. It probably doesn't really work, because white also creates some weaknesses and opens up the position for the bishops, but I just didn't really want to allow it. Like, for example, this I was thinking about, it has to be a right for black, like bishop b4, for example, king f1. I was just worried that white would get knight g3 and then maybe occupy the f5 square somehow, but yeah, shouldn't be anything for white, honestly, because the d4 pawn is now also can also become quite weak. But that was just the reason why I took on d3, not to allow that, and I immediately pushed f5. And I knew this sort of plan from another move order, which I think is through the line with queen b3. With queen b6, take here. And here white often goes for this quite strange looking move, king d2. To just prepare bishop d3, and black usually doesn't take here because it would open up the a line. And I think it goes something like this: knight d7, bishop d3 here, take, rook g8, g3, and now f5. And this is kind of the idea for black to now play knight e4. At some moment, queen exchange could come, but it was not really necessary yet. And after knight e4, now f2 is hanging, and black wants to regroup the knight to d6, where the pawn on f5 is then protected. What I didn't actually realize in the game was that my pawn is on h5. Of course, white's pawn is also on h4 in the game, but the pawn on h5 is, of course, an extra weakness. I didn't really realize that in the game, that is kind of a difference here. But let's get back to what happened in the game. So I played f5, and I thought if I managed to consolidate everything, I should be completely fine. But I have to be quite careful. He played rook h3, which I thought was by far the best try. And now I need to think how to consolidate my pieces, because at the moment he's threatening rook f3, immediately picking up the pawn on f5. And I also thought that rook g8 here doesn't really do anything special. Of course, he's not going to go g3, but just for example, king f1. And then the rook on g8 can sometimes even be misplaced if a knight appears on f4 and or g3, because then h5 would be hanging. So instead, I played knight b6, which I think was quite an important idea, because I need to regroup the knight to d6 just to protect the pawn on f5. And I was sort of lucky that it worked out tactically for me, because if you would have gone rook f3 here, I have knight c4 and b2 is hanging, and I could go back to d6. He actually didn't choose this move order, which was probably also very accurate. And he went for knight e2 first. Because if you would start with rook f3, then after knight c4, well, first of all, rook f5, knight takes b2 seemed to both of us like it's not really what white wants to allow, because now my bishop can be quite useful on the queen side, and it could become quite strong, and my pawns will also start moving quite soon. And the point was, if after knight c4 he plays b3 here, I can transpose to the game probably with knight d6, but I also have this beautiful extra option with bishop b4. The point being that he cannot capture here, because after take, those two pieces, one of them is going to get lost. So that's why he started with knight e2. I think that was quite accurate. And here I went knight c4, now b3, and of course now bishop b4 doesn't work, because now he can just move the rook and the knight on c3 is protected. So instead I went back knight d6, and now he played f3, which I was quite happy to see, because he will not have any more rook f3 options. I was more worried about rook f3 immediately, I believe. The point my opponent told me why he played f3 was to avoid knight e4 in many cases, which I think is also very sensible, because in some cases knight e4 does work. But still, here I wasn't entirely sure what I would play. Konstantin, my opponent, after the game told me that king d7 was the move he considered. And after knight g3 now, he said that knight e4 works, and probably does. At least that's the conclusion we came to, because after take, fe4, rook f7, king e6, both of those rooks are hanging and I'm winning material. And apart from that, after knight e4, I always have threats with bishop b4. So if he captures on f5 with the knight, I have bishop b4. What we briefly considered was, hang on, rook f5. Yeah, I think that was what we quickly considered. Now knight c3, rook c3, and bishop b4, this kind of exchange sacrifice. I guess that white should play king d2 here. And it's quite hard to evaluate. Pawn on h5 is weak. I'm gonna win the exchange. Probably black should be okay here, because he has some open files on the king side. But yeah, I have to be quite honest with you that I didn't really calculate king d7. So while editing, I unfortunately had to realize that for some reason my audio was not recorded after somewhere this point. So I'm recording it again. Hopefully, yeah, it will not disturb the flow, and I will hopefully explain similar things then, or hopefully the same things which I just explained in the previous recording. So we just left it off that in this line after rook f3, that king d7 was one important line. I just briefly checked now that king d7 is a decent move. At least the computer says knight a4 does give white some advantage, which is a move which both of us didn't see at all. So yeah, it was good to note that. But bishop e7 anyway, the move I intended to play should also be okay. If he goes g3, then the rook on f3 is kind of trapped. And it's also not clear how he's going to attack the f5 pawn, so this looks pretty bad for white. I mean, maybe not bad, but at least the rook is really not getting out in the near future. And the line I was thinking about was knight g3, and then bishop takes h4, knight f5, and now probably knight f5, rook f5, and then something like bishop e7. And I thought I have to be a little bit careful for sure, but with precise play I should be able to hold this. For example, one position I was thinking about was if e4, take everything, and rook d8. And it seemed like I'm overall quite solid here, even though of course I need to be a bit careful to hold it, just because white's pieces are a bit more active and my pawn on h5 can also be a bit weak, even though I could push it to h4 at some moment. So yeah, this was my calculation. Probably would have went for. I mean, white also doesn't have to push for e4. They can also try to play maybe f3 and e4. So there are a couple of different options. Seemed like white should be a bit better, but not the end of the world. I was thinking. But anyway, my opponent went f3 just with the idea that knight e4 is going to be avoided. I mean, there are those ideas with knight e4, which he understandably was worried about. But of course, after f3, now he cannot attack the f5 pawn with his rook anymore, and therefore I was sort of relieved to see that. So bishop e7, knight f4, king d7. I thought that the next few moves were not really anything special at all. Rook h6 with the point that at some moment, if he wants to regroup the knight to g3, I can go rook h8 and yeah, protect the pawn like that. One funny thing was that I was thinking about something a little bit similar. Was it knight f4 here, now that I'm realizing? Because there was one line where I thought it's a bit close for me. I think it was that one here. Maybe I can play knight e4 at some moment. But I was looking at some position like this, and here I thought rook h7, and I thought I should be holding that. The point being that if he takes right away, I have rook h8. And then I'm gonna capture on h4 on the next move, and I win back the pawn. And apart from that, if he doesn't do anything, then I can go rook h8 on the next move. That was my way of thinking. Maybe I missed something there as well. But he went f3, bishop e7, knight f4, king d7, king f2, rook h6. And he hesitated a bit by bringing the knight to g3, but firstly he improves his pieces, which makes a lot of sense. But I was quite confident here that I do have sort of a stable fortress, and the only way which white can play for something is to go for b4 at some moment. But once he does that, he's also creating some weaknesses in his own camp. So I was sort of looking forward to seeing that and maybe to create some chances. Konstantin went knight ce2, trying to get the knight to g3, and here I went for knight e8, which is maybe not exactly necessary, but I thought bringing the knight to g7 gives me some extra options. First of all, I'm also defending the h5 pawn and the f5 pawn, and in some case I could also play bishop d6 and knight e6, which I also got in the game later on. Maybe I could also just wait somehow here. It's not so clear how white is making progress. Like if I just do something like this and then just wait like that. Probably he also has to go b4, a4 at some moment to try something, but maybe the computer prefers to go for that. Who knows? But I'm also quite happy with what I played. So b4, a6, I cannot take right away because then after rook b3, I'm going to lose the b7 pawn and the a7 pawn as well. If a5, then a3, and then on the next moment just rook b7. So this is not good. Instead I went a6, now g3, just protecting h4. If a4, then I thought it's at least an option for me to take here, because then I have a5 and white doesn't have a3 here. Still knight d3 is maybe possible, but I thought I'm not in much danger here if I just put the knight to d6. I also don't have to take maybe, but that was anyway my intention. He went g3, knight c7. Again, not so clear where the knight should go. g7 would also be possible, but I thought having it on c7 is more flexible because I'm also having an eye on the b5 square. I could also just maybe go back with the knight to c4. That's another option, but I didn't really see the plan here. Maybe I should just wait. But it wasn't clear to me what the knight on c4 is doing in those positions. So I went knight c7, rook b1, bishop d6, a4, continuing with the minority attack, and now knight e6. This was the moment where I realized the game should be heading towards a draw pretty fast, because I'm ready to exchange everything on f4 now and go to a rook endgame, which tends to be quite drawish. He played b5. Generally, if he takes here, I'm always very happy because I'm repairing my own pawn structure, and g3 is going to be weak. So b5 was very sensible. And here a takes b5 was the solid decision. I'm still not sure. A line which I saw, which was quite funny, but I haven't checked it yet, was c takes b5. And now after knight takes d5, my idea was to take here. And if rook takes b7 check, then I have king c6. Rook b6 check and king takes d5. And the funny thing is that I'm not getting mated, but here even have a double attack. White could still go king e2, maybe it goes on, but I didn't see a way how my king is going to get mated, and at the moment I'm at least a piece up here. So maybe this works. Knight e7 was another move I considered, but here I saw that I have rook g6 and I'm trapping the knight on g8. So this looked okay for me. Maybe there's a mate I'm missing, like maybe there's something here. The king does look quite exposed, but yeah, I didn't see it. But I'm gonna tell you what was my actual problem here. The problem was that if a takes b5, I was thinking about knight takes f4, and now e takes f4, and now the only move I thought I have available is a5, because otherwise he's gonna open the b file, and my king is a bit exposed, and my rooks are not really near the queen side, so I didn't want to allow that. Also, if I take, then the rook is going to take, and d5 and b7 is going to be weak. d5 is probably just going to fall, and after that also f5 is very weak. So I thought this is not good at all. But a5 was quite interesting, and I thought if I get this pawn to a3, I mean, I could definitely start thinking about playing for a win here. But I thought I'm not in time, because he can go knight c3, attacking the pawn on d5. I cannot even protect it at the moment. Maybe there's some way to sacrifice it for me. But I didn't see it. There was one nice final line here, which I'm gonna show you, which I saw in the game, which was that after rook g6, first of all, king e6 doesn't do anything because white can just give a check and then take on d5 on the next move. So that's why I was considering rook g6. Now knight takes d5. Now the problem is that rook g3 doesn't work because of the fork. And one cool line which I saw was that if king e6, now if the knight would go back, then I can just take on g3, and I'm probably just much better here because my rooks are so active and the bishop as well. But the problem was knight b6, and now the thing is if I take on g3, then white can give a check here, king f6, and now either knight d5 or knight d7, king has to go to the g file, and then white can capture the rook on g3. So that was quite a beautiful line, which I looked at, and therefore I rejected taking on b5 with a c pawn. Still, I'm quite curious. I'm going to check that afterwards, how knight takes d5 is, what's going on there. But I took here, a takes b5, and now I took on f4, and he took on b5 with a check, b takes e6, and now he took with the knight, which I think is the best decision. If he takes with either of the pawns, then I think he could even be risking something, especially if g takes f4, I can just go rook g6, infiltrate on the g file, and also h4 is going to be weak. If rook b7, I can always just play bishop c7 or king e6, but my idea was mostly bishop c7. And if e takes f4, that should still be alright for white, but also here, after something like rook b8 and takes, I definitely could imagine that I would play on here because the pawn on d4 can be weak. White's majority on the king side is pretty useless, and I can somehow try to activate my rook and at some moment maybe push for c5. Yeah, should also still be a draw, but I'm definitely not the one who should be risking something here. So he took with the knight, and here I decided to go for the rook endgame with bishop f4. I could also go for something like this, but I just didn't want to give him the opportunity to maybe move the knight, and should also still be a draw, but I felt like bishop f4 is just more straightforward. He took with the e-pawn. If he takes with the g-pawn, I think I'm just too fast with my rooks entering, and white king is in a lot of danger. So he takes f4, and now was an interesting moment because I went for the move rook a8, which I still think was quite an important decision to make, because the very logical move rook g6 I thought is not as easy. The obvious line is rook b7 check, which I calculated. Now king d6 and rook f7, rook g3. First of all, when you look at it, it looks quite attractive for black because the rooks are entering, and it looks like the white king could be in a checkmate net. But white takes on f5, and the funny thing is that I don't have checkmate here because after rook e8, white can just go rook e5. And some position like this, I could definitely imagine seeing going completely wrong for me, because if white pushes f5 and activates the king, he's going to be a pawn up and his king is super active. So I thought that this position is quite risky. Also rook g1, I saw rook g5. which I thought was also meant quite a lot of trouble for me. Maybe this is still a draw somehow, but I didn't really see the concrete path. Also, h5 is going to fall in many variations. I think we discovered that, or at least we talked about after the game, that king e6 might still work. But I thought that this was maybe the problem, rook c7. Because again, if I take on g3, white can take here, the king has to go to the g file, and then g3 is going to fall. And then we discovered king g7 in the post-game analysis. And here we thought that it should probably be a draw, but in the previous recording, which unfortunately failed, I saw that rook c3 might be possible to just pick up c6, but still it's maybe just a draw. That's kind of to the conclusion which I came after rook a4. Still might be a draw since king e3, check here, and I'm probably just gonna continue checking. But yeah, now rook c3 is gonna come, so it's not so easy maybe. Rook g2, rook c5, not so easy perhaps. But the solution which I chose in game rook a8 I thought was quite clinical, because now I'm just trying to control the second rank, and I thought this is just way more important than picking up the pawn on g3. He played rook b7 check, and now I played this move king e8, which I think is also quite nice. My first instinct was actually to go, or my first idea was to go king d6, because king e8 is such a move you don't really consider it, because it just looks a bit wrong. But once you realize the defensive setup, it makes a lot of sense. King d6 looks more active, and I thought it should also work, since after rook takes f7, rook a2 check, king f1, I thought rook e6, and I'm probably just entering on the second rank. I thought something like this should always be at least a perpetual check for me, since I have some checks and also some checkmate ideas as well. But then I started to realize that my king might also be in some checkmate net, for example, after rook e3. I think that's the move I was thinking about, but still, black should be in time to make a draw here. I mean, one idea is just to go rook e7 and rook d7, but maybe rook e6 still holds. I think this was one of the lines I was considering. Probably white is not even threatening to take here, because maybe rook e2, but then rook f6. I was thinking about this endgame for a little bit, thought that it should also be a draw, and maybe that's just the case. I can protect c6 with rook c2, and white's king is also fairly passive. Maybe rook c7, rook c2, king e1 though. The question is if I can push c5 at some moment, but oof, this pawn endgame. How is this? King d2, d4 looks quite bad for black, but maybe this is holding as well. King d6, and if king e3, then king e5 should also be a draw. Probably there were like millions of mistakes in this analysis, but it just felt like this should also be a draw. But then I saw king e8, and I just decided it's much simpler, because after rook e3 check, I'm just going king f8, and if he goes rook e7, then I just play rook f6, protect f7, everything is protected, and he cannot enter anyway at all. So he went rook eb3 and offered a draw, which I accepted, because I have a defensive setup and not an attacking setup, so there's not really a way which I can win as well. My pawns are not weak here, because the rook can protect them, but in the long run, of course, they could be a bit weak. So therefore, my pawn majority here also doesn't use anything, because it's also blocked by the white pawn. So therefore, I accepted his drawing offer, and I'm quite happy with the game. I think it was overall quite a nice quality from both of us. Should be pretty high accuracy overall, and I think that we both saw many important and also nice lines. So I'm quite happy about the game overall, how it went with the black pieces. It's against so good players, you cannot force it, and a draw in those situations is perfectly reasonable for sure. So that puts me in shared first. I believe that now there should be at least, I think it's 3 players, or 4 players that share first place. That should be all of the favorites, Valentin Dragnev, myself, Dominic Horvat, and also Konstantin Peyrer, my opponent from today. So those are the current leaders. But of course, still 7 rounds to be played, so yeah, nothing has been decided yet. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed today's recap. If you did, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. You can also check out my website, felixbroberger.com, socials on Instagram, Twitter, and so on. And thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow.